I'm Neil Singer, Safety Director for the Embraer Jets Operator Association. Welcome to our video series, Good to Great, where we will provide you with the tools to enhance the safe operation of your aircraft. Enjoy. Let's look at a few avionics tips and tricks for situations that don't come up that frequently and make it that much more confusing to execute when you do need to. One type of user waypoint we might need to create is what's called a radial distance user waypoint. So imagine we're sitting on the ramp here in Bedford, Massachusetts, and we're going to make a trip down to Martha's Vineyard. And our clearance is pretty simple. There's just one fix. After takeoff, expect direct to the Martha's Vineyard 359 radial 35 DME fix, then direct destination. Well, that's not an intersection that is named and charted, so we need to create a waypoint there. So to create the waypoint, we put the cursor where we want it to be, and we can name it whatever we want, but we always want to name it something that will make sense when we look at it in the flight plan on the map. So I'm going to name it MVY 359, since that's the radial we're going to be defining it on. The system will recognize that that doesn't exist and ask if we want to create one. We need to make sure we have the right type of waypoint, in this case radial distance, since we do know a radial and a distance. First, we have to define the anchor waypoint, which is the MVY VOR. Then we have to define the radial, 359. Finally, we have to say how far out on that 359 radial, in this case, 35 DME fix. If we're only going to do this user waypoint once, we can check temporary, it'll be deleted. Otherwise, if we do this routinely, we could leave the temporary box unchecked and it'll stay through power cycles. Once we confirm that we've entered it all correctly, we're going to select Load Waypoint to Flight Plan. That waypoint is going to now go in our flight plan, and we can see on our MFD that it exists where we would expect it to be. Another use of a radial distance user waypoint is if we're given a clearance to fly a radial away from a VOR, not to a defined distance, but just to join a radial. So for example, let's imagine we have the clearance out of Bedford. After takeoff, fly runway heading to join the Boston 230 radial outbound. So sometimes ATC just wants to park us on a radial until they can vector us off. We might commonly have to file a clearance like this when we're flying an obstacle departure procedure or a runway analysis special procedure where we're just flying a radial until we get to a certain altitude and then we can proceed on course. So again, what we need to do is we need to somehow define the Boston 230 radial in the avionics. So first, we know we're going to be flying this radial away from the BOS VOR. So we always start when we're trying to build user waypoints with what we know. We know we're going to be flying away from Boston, so let's put the BOS VOR in there. And then next, we want to define a waypoint that lies on the Boston 230 radial. So we're going to name it BOS 230. Again, the name doesn't mean anything. We're going to name it BOS 230, and we're going to say that yes, we want to create a user waypoint. Now we are going to do a radial distance. We know the anchor. We know that the radial is 230. Now the distance doesn't matter except that we want it to be a distance large enough we won't reach it. Because what we're going to do is we're just going to define a long segment that we can join. So 100 miles is a nice distance when you're trying to do this kind of clearance. So by creating this fix on the Boston 230 radial, 100 miles away from the VOR, and putting it at the appropriate spot in our flight plan, we now can activate the leg that is between Boston and this waypoint we've created. And when we activate that leg, our HSI will slew around to 230, our course is drawn correctly, and we could fly our clearance, which is runway heading to join that radial. I just want to point something out that the more sharp-eyed viewer might notice, which is that the defined track between BOS and this waypoint we've created actually shows as 28, not 230. That just has to do with the way that the system calculates for magnetic versus true north. There are slight differences in its database, but ultimately this line is defined correctly, and it's okay if that number is off by a couple degrees. If it was off by 4 or 5 degrees or more, certainly, then you'd want to recheck that you inputted it correctly. Another type of user waypoint we may have to create is called radial. This is where we don't know the distance from an anchor fix, but we know the radial off of 2 anchor fixes. So as an example, we're sitting here on the ground in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, flying out to Martha's Vineyard, and our initial part of our clearance is to join the Harrisburg 039 radial to intercept Tango 212, which is a airway off the Selinsgrove VOR. So we know we're going to be flying the Harrisburg 039 radial. When we look at our low altitude en route chart, we can see that Tango 212 is defined by the 078 radial off of Selinsgrove. So we have 2 anchors and we have 2 radials, so we can go ahead and create that fix. On the G1000, we just want to put our cursor where the fix is going to go, and then we can name a user waypoint anything we want to. We could call it the Selinsgrove 078, for example. We could call it the Harrisburg 059. We could call it Tango 212. It doesn't matter what we name it. When we try to create this waypoint and it doesn't exist, the system is going to say, this doesn't exist, do you want to create it? Again, the name has no impact on the definition, but we do want to name it something that makes some sense to us. So the first thing I need to do is on the G1000, I need to tell the system what kind of waypoint I want to create. And I have 3 choices. We're going to do radial right now. And now we need to define the 2 fixes and the radials that will define this intersection. So we already know one of them was the Harrisburg 039. Press enter. Our next anchor point is Selinsgrove, Sierra Echo Golf. We want to, of course, pick the right one. And then this is going to be, as we already looked at on the chart, the 078 from Selinsgrove. When we press enter, we've now defined this point. It shows us where it is in space, which probably won't mean a lot to us. And then we can go load this waypoint to the flight plan. Before we do that though, since this is just a one-time thing, what we're going to do is we're going to check the temporary box. That way the next power cycle this will be deleted. So now when we load this waypoint to the flight plan, we have this fix. That intersection exists where the 039 joins Tango 212. If we activate the leg leading to this user waypoint, we now have defined the Harrisburg 039. Our course should be set to 039, and we'll be able to join that. Now, there's one more step we have to do though. Because we just created a waypoint at essentially a lat long, just a point in space, the Garmin doesn't recognize it as belonging to Tango 212. So what we need to do is we need to add the first fix on that airway in the direction we're flying so that we can, again, have the system recognize that we're actually going to be on an airway. And that would be looking at our chart, the Bless intersection. And now with the Bless intersection in here, if we want to load airways from that point on, we can do it easily. And a quick tip on the G1000, if you want to load an airway, we can of course go into the menu and we have an option to load the airway. We'll have to do a little bit of twisting, but there's a little shortcut we can do, which is with the cursor on the location you're going to put the first fix after the anchor on the airway. If you just press 0 and then select, when you press any number or any key, it lets you start typing a waypoint in, but the one soft key that exists is load airway, and when you press select, it selects that. So a quick 0 select will let you pull up airways. In this case, Bless is only on Tango 212, so we could then pick the fix that corresponds with where we'll be exiting that airway. We've been told to expect the ILS 22 left into Detroit, and coming in from the east, we loaded Puzzle as the initial approach fix, but ATC just gave us a turn to the right, told us that's a downwind vector, expecting vectors onto final. Now, if we activate vectors to final, what is going to happen is we're going to lose most of our fixes after the final approach fix. It's just going to preserve one fix. As you can see on the approach plate, there's a lot of step downs between here and there, and we're going to lose the ability to use VNAV for that function. So rather than activate vectors to final, here we are with the approach as we had it. What we're going to do is select MACOM, which is the last fix on final, and we're going to select direct to MACOM, but rather than activating direct to MACOM on the present position course, we're going to select a course that matches the final approach course of 216. Now, when we activate that direct, we can see we have the same effect of vectors to final, which is a nice long final drawn. Our HSI is set to the proper course, but now when we ultimately receive vectors and intercept the final, we've preserved all of the fixes before the final approach fix and all of the VNAV altitudes. Thank you for joining us, and a special thank you to ECTS for the generous donation of the simulator time and staffing that makes these videos possible. Fly safely and look for more videos soon. And if there's a topic you'd like to see us cover, please send an email to safety@ejoa.aero.